Middle. I'm Cara Stern,
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
and recently we heard the housing minister talk about how international students at universities contribute to the housing affordability crisis. Let's talk about that because I know it's something that you've been highlighting for a while now, Mike, and I really don't think people understand how it works. So, to start us off, why does a university need international students?
So that's a great question. And this is mostly a made in Ontario phenomenon. That what we've seen over the last 15 to 20 years, arguably 40 years, depending on who you ask, is that there's been reduced funding to colleges and universities across Ontario from the provincial government. And one of the ways that institutions can make up for that money is to increase the enrollment of international students. International students, they're paying three, five, seven, whatever times the tuition. So it's a very lucrative source of money. And what happened was that schools absolutely used international student enrollments to make up for government funding shortfalls. But what we've seen is at least a handful of schools go way beyond that. That you know, you have this magic money tree, and most of the schools kind of shook that money tree until they had enough money to cover their losses. But a number of them were like, "Hey, we have a magic money tree. Why stop now? Let's just keep shaking this thing and have more and more dollars come out." So there was a real difference in responses between different institutions where some were like, "Okay, let's just try and make ourselves whole." And others were like, "Yay, free money. Let's get as much as we possibly can." We've seen in the last decade a number of colleges across Ontario enter into public-private partnerships with private colleges in the GTA. So you'll have a lot of colleges who are, say, in Northern Ontario or Southwestern Ontario who would like to have more international students, but international students might not want to live there. So they do these partnership arrangements with schools in the GTA and have their international students attend these campuses as well. So that's a lot of what we're seeing is these mostly colleges, though some universities as well, use international students enrollment as a way to make up for funding shortfalls.
So, how do they decide how many people to bring in a given year?
So it's entirely up to the school's judgment, though there are some rules governing the private public partnerships. Though those rules don't seem to be particularly strongly enforced. But it's otherwise entirely up to the school. So there's one school in particular in Ontario, one college that went from having about 700 international students 7 years ago to something like 11,000 in the most recent data. So you have these schools that have 1,500% increases in just 7 years. So it's a massive increase, and it's not coupled with any necessarily any building of on-campus student residences or things like that. So when you plop an extra 10,000 students in a community like Kitchener Waterloo, that is going to create some real tensions on the rental market.
Are there any rules at all about what percentage of the student population a university has to have housing for if they're going to accept that many?
None whatsoever. And we're seeing, particularly again at the college level, there are schools that are now 80%, 80% international students. So no, it's a bit of a wild west that way. That there is no requirement for any schools to have on campus housing. And traditionally, colleges in Ontario haven't really had much on campus housing for a very good reason. That they're called community colleges because they historically had educated people who already live in the community. So there was no need for additional housing. So a lot of schools simply didn't have any. Really wasn't their responsibility. But now they've pivoted to bringing in students who don't already live in the community. That's creating these tensions.
The federal government has been ramping up immigration numbers with a goal of 500,000 newcomers annually starting by 2025. Are those international students included in those numbers?
So no, they're not. It's or at least not directly. They're two different streams, but It's important to note how the immigration system and the international student system integrate with each other. That if we go back to Canada's history, there's always been a problem in this country with integrating newcomers into the labor market. So you will have, somebody who's 28 or 29 and trained as a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer somewhere overseas. They immigrate over to Canada and then find that their credentials aren't recognized, and they end up driving a taxi or working at a pizza restaurant, that kind of thing, which isn't great for them and it's not great for Canada. So about 15 years ago, the Canadian government said, "Well, hey, this doesn't really make much sense. Instead of having people come over at 28 or 29, why not have them come over at 18 or 19? They can get their degree or diploma in Canada and then stay in Canada, work in Canada, and then immigrate." So there's this kind of period of pre-immigration that goes on. And that was essentially the logic of what the government's trying to do, and part of why the demand for international students to come to Canada has risen so much. That is, it's basically been integrated into the immigration system, but it's one of those things that it makes sense as a blackboard exercise, but the implementation has fallen down a little bit. And to the pure data point, no, they're not counted as immigrants or in the immigration number. So even though we have an immigration target of just under 500,000, we can have far greater growth in international students and also groups like temporary foreign workers and others who aren't considered permanent residents of Canada.
Oh man, it seems almost like irresponsible of the university to be inviting so many people to study there if they know they don't have homes for them.
And there's a lot of finger pointing that goes on, and I think this is one of the reasons why this is kind of ballooned out of control, because everybody can credibly say it's somebody else's fault. That
It's a
the
Canada story.
It's a Canadian story, right? Because there's 3 different, parts to this, and they can all kind of point fingers either way. That, the schools themselves, and they're the ones that we usually get their fingers pointed at them, will say, "Well, look, we kinda have to do this because the provincial government has cut our funding, so we need to make up that money somewhere. And the provincial government wouldn't let us do this if it weren't a problem." The province can then turn around and say, "Well, it's up to the schools to act responsibly," but also that the federal government plays a role through the immigration system, and it was the federal government who introduced programs like the post graduation work permit program, and basically integrated higher education with the immigration system. So the province could say, "Well, look, actually, no, this is a federal issue because the feds have spent the last 15 years trying to sort of co-opt education into the immigration sector." And the federal government can turn around going, "Well, we just control immigration, higher education, that's a under the constitution, that's a provincial responsibility, so it's up to the province to do the right thing." So everybody points fingers at each other, and nothing ever changes.
I think a lot of people look at these numbers of international students and feel like, what's the benefit to us to have them here? So there is a benefit in terms of getting people to study here and have qualifications where they could later get permanent residence and actually use those qualifications. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. If this system worked correctly, it would makes a ton of sense, and it's better for the students and future immigrants, and better for Canada as well. That if you have students come over, first of all, while they're here, they contribute to the local economy in the city or town in which their college or university is located. So that makes sense. And it also just logically makes sense that if we have trouble integrating newcomers because of things like credentials or things like just not understanding how the Canadian business market works, we'll have them, learn both those hard skills and soft skills in Canada, and they're going to have much better, at least in theory, much better labor market outcomes. So the whole thing makes sense again as sort of a theory and blackboard exercises, But the challenge is that we haven't built enough housing for them, and that obviously affects the international students themselves, because they're having to come over and finding that rents are way higher than they had anticipated. But it also affects other renters in those markets. But it also affects first time home buyers, because what's happening in a lot of these communities is investors are buying up single family homes to turn them into student residences. So now, if you're a first time home buyer in a college town like a Kingston, Waterloo, a London, or Windsor, it's really hard for you to get a starter home, because all of these starter homes are getting bought up by investors who typically have more money than first time home buyers.
I know that's also the story in Guelph. I wanted to read out a tweet that the mayor put out where he said, I heard about parents looking to rent a parking spot for their son who will now be living in a van. The dad equipped the van with a heater and solar panel, and the kid will use the school's showers and bathrooms because nothing is available or affordable, for crying out loud. Have you ever heard anything like that before? Because when I read that, I thought, oh my goodness, if that's where parents are at, like they're renting parking spots for their kids to live in cars, that is just wild.
Unfortunately, it's this is not an isolated incident. We actually saw this last summer. Last summer seemed to be particularly challenging in a lot of communities, and you can actually see it in the data. So you have all these anecdotes of people living in their cars and coming up with all kinds of different arrangements, which obviously is really problematic. But you also see it in the data. Like if you look at rent price data for London, Ontario in 2022, basically a one bedroom apartment, it goes for about $1,400, 1450 or so on, pretty consistently in the first part of 2022. And then from about Canada Day to mid September, it shoots up and then stays there. So you have rent prices going up 20% in 1 year in London for new leases, but it wasn't distributed across the entire month. Basically, it was just this huge step after all the students, both domestic and international, arrived. So this is a huge, huge issue, and it's causing people to not be able to go to college or university. I hear stories of people who got into a Guelph or got into even a Western, and then found out they couldn't afford to live to London. So they're still continuing to live with their parents in Mississauga and having to commute back and forth to class. So
Oh,
that's
wow.
not good for them. That's not good for the environment. It's just a bad situation all around.
I know that universities own land, so what's just stopping them from building more residences?
Well, there's a couple things, and universities are to put this in some context. That we've seen Western, for example, announce 1,000 new residences and things like that. So the universities are, and some colleges are as well. I think there's a couple challenges. That first, they tend to be some of the schools tend to be just cash constrained, right? That they don't have the upfront capital to do this. They can't use tuition dollars to use this. They can't use operating funds. They need capital funds, and some of them simply don't have it, particularly the smaller colleges. But there's a second interesting thing going on here when you talk to people at the colleges and universities in executive offices, and many of them believe that this is actually a bubble, that at some point government is going to shut this off, and it could be the Canadian government, or it could be the government in India, as the majority of college students in international students at Ontario colleges actually come from a single country. They come from India. So, if either the Canadian government or the Indian government ever decided that this was problematic and shut off the taps, then this starts looking like a bubble that bursts. So they don't want to make 30-year or 50-year investments in new residence spaces if 2 years from now their enrollments are going down because the international student bubble burst. So they're hesitant to make big capital expenditures when they don't really have a great sense what the future looks like.
I remember you once said on Twitter about how the same thing stopping any developer from building homes is what's stopping universities from building more residences. Do you find that neighbors are generally opposed to having students in their neighborhoods?
Yeah, I think there is local opposition sometimes to building student residences and things like that. But the irony is, if you don't, then what happens is all those single family homes around people, get turned into de facto student residences by investors. So the students are going to live somewhere, and they're often willing to live in groups of 10 or more, which makes it very attractive for investors, particularly investors who might be willing to look the other way as you have overcrowding and things going against local bylaws. So it is a big challenge in neighborhoods. So you have those challenges, and as well, all of the things that might be stopping developers today, like higher interest rates and things like that, are also applying to the colleges and universities who are considering building residences.
I want to talk about solutions, and I always like to start with the lowest hanging fruit. So, what's something that could be implemented quickly to improve the system?
Well, I think the biggest thing would be to have the provincial government scale this back, and the provincial government could do that fairly easily by telling schools that they have to keep enrollments flat or decline even in future years. So that would be the easiest thing to have happen. The next easiest thing to have happen would be the schools themselves actually reducing enrollment. The federal government can, at least in theory, kind of do that as well through the international student visas. They're a little bit challenged there because they would have to design this in a way that's constitutional, again, because they don't control the higher ed system. But I do think if they put stricter controls on student visa, and basically got those rejection rates up even higher, that would probably not only reduce the number of international students, but make sure that the ones who are coming over can actually, afford to live here. So that's the immediate thing. Most of the immediate solutions are on the demand side. On the supply side, ideally we just build more on-campus student housing, and there are models to do this. That during the 2008 2009 financial crisis, and after that, we had the Harper government had their economic action plan. We probably remember all those blue signs with all the arrows. One of the components of that plan was to build more buildings on campuses. Now, these were mostly like labs and classrooms and things like that, but there's no reason why the federal government couldn't do something like that again, but for student residences. And basically, how the model would work is the federal government would make a pot of cash available and say, okay, if schools want to access this cash to build student residences, first of all, we would need matching money from the province, and then the school themselves would kick in a little bit of money. You throw it all in a pot, and you could get a lot of on-campus housing built, which would not only help the students, but ease the pressure on the rental markets in these communities.
I know that you've been talking about this for such a long time, so I keep seeing when I hear the housing minister say that, I keep thinking, what's it like to be Mike Moffatt right now, knowing that this is an issue that you've been trying to raise attention to, and finally people in power are listening? What's that feel like?
It's been a little surreal, and to be honest, I was a little snarky with the media a few weeks ago. That I was in PEI during the federal cabinet retreat, and they were asking me questions like that one. I was joking with them. I said, I've been talking about this stuff since like 2019, and back then, like, none of you cared, and now they have my phone ringing off the hook. So, to be honest, it's a bit surreal. That it used to be few of us, like myself and now Alex Usher and a handful of others, would talk about this stuff on Twitter. I would have the occasional Medium post, and I'd go back and look at the Medium numbers, and if 100 people read it, like that was a post that did well. And now, absolutely, it's the phone's ringing off the hook, and it does feel a little bit like the issue of the day. And you do wonder, like, a month or two from now, are we going to be looking at some other component of the housing market to sort of identify as a challenge? And I think that's important. Like the international student side is a real challenge, particularly in Ontario and particularly in kind of like mid-sized college cities. Again, your Kitchener Waterloos, your Londons, and so on. But there's a lot of other stuff going on in the housing market, and particularly outside of Ontario. So it is just one issue, but it's an important one. And it's surreal to basically see it going from this thing that nobody talked about to it seems to be every second story in the media over the last couple of weeks.
I'm excited to hear from other people about what like other parts of this because this is such a difficult story to solve. Like there's a few solutions you laid out, but I want to hear from more people. So I know we're going to come back to this in more depth and from more perspectives. But this is a really great place to kind of start us off and help people understand like how did this issue begin and get us to start thinking of solutions. So thanks for explaining it to us.
Well, thank you for your interest. This is a very important issue for local communities and the students themselves. And I think that we got to end on this point that we have to understand in this discussion that international students aren't the cause of this; they're the victims of it. That the cause of this is essentially poor planning, between two levels of government and higher education. So for our community's sake and particularly for our students' sake, both domestic and international. Like we got to get this thing fixed.
Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear from you. We're happy to hear suggestions and questions, so please get in touch. This episode was produced by Meredith Martin and hosted by Mike Moffatt and myself, Cara Stern. Until next time.